Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Cristian Hernandez-Blick, Head of Public Programming here at Interspecies Internet. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you on behalf of the trustees and the organization to another Interspecies Conversations lecture. Interspecies Conversations is a monthly online lecture series where leading thinkers share ideas and research that deepens our understanding of animal communication and cognition, often highlighting related insights into the behavior, conservation, and welfare of non-human species. We aim to platform emerging discoveries and host open discussions where the community can join the conversation with questions and feedback. And if you enjoy today's talk, please consider donating to Interspecies Internet to help support our programming, events, and other projects and activities. You can find a donation link on our website, that's interspecies.io, as well as in the video descriptions on our YouTube channel. All right, so today we're delighted to be joined by Kirsty Graham, who will be presenting their talk, Every Body Communicates, Ape Gestures, Postures, and Displays. Kirsty E. Graham is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Hunter College in the Animal Behavior and Conservation MA program. From 2020 to 2024, they were a research fellow at the University of St. Andrews, working with Dr. Kat Hobater, comparing gestural communication across bonobos, chimpanzees, humans, gorillas, and orangutans. From 2017 to 2020, they were a research associate with Professor Katie Slocombe at the University of York, looking at the development of joint attention across humans, chimpanzees, and Sulawesi crested macaques. They are particularly interested in pragmatic and semantic meaning in non-human communication. So in their talk, Graham will explore the study of bodily communication in non-human primates, new research tools and methods in the field, and extending this research beyond great apes to map the evolutionary history of bodily communication. As the abstract for this presentation reads, many species move their bodies in communicative ways, but we are only just beginning to scratch the surface of non-human bodily communication. Most research efforts, including Kirsty's, have gone toward describing and understanding the gestures used by our closest relatives, the non-human great apes. Based on this research, Kirsty will share new open source video coding and pose estimation tools that could strengthen our ability to compare bodily communication across research groups and study species. They will then make the case for a holistic approach to studying bodily communication, including gestures, postures, and displays. By taking these tools and approach beyond great apes, we can build out a phylogeny of bodily communication and hopefully deepen our understanding of how this ability has evolved. Kirsty, once again, we're very excited to hear from you today, and whenever you're ready, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. I'll just set up my screen sharing. All right. So obviously I'll answer more substantive questions at the end of the talk, but if you have any clarifications throughout the talk, please feel free to raise your hand. If you want me to go through anything again or share any of the videos again, please let me know. Yeah, so I did a lot. I've worked for a very long time with Dr. Kat Hobater, who gave a lecture here, I think 9 months ago, sometime last year, on the sort of state of great ape gesture research. And Kat and I often joke about sharing a brain. And so I talked with her about what she'd gone through, and I thought that maybe I would go for something more forward looking. So, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'm not going to be presenting a whole lot of results, but I'm going to be suggesting ways in which how we've approached studying great ape gesture might be applied more broadly to bodily communication in general and across to other species. I know at the end of Kat's talk, she made a plea for large-scale collaboration as the only way that we are going to decode non-human communication in meaningful ways. And so this builds on that and hopefully shares some helpful resources. So historically, bodily communication, as we think about it in non-human primates, has been studied kind of in silos. Um, Researchers tend to focus on gesture, or to focus on display, or to focus on body posture, or as the case may be, to not focus on body posture, because it can be quite difficult to get at, as we're going to talk about in a bit. And then even within these silos, there are completely different approaches to within the gesture silo. You might focus on a single gesture type, or on gesture development, or on cataloging a gestural repertoire. Um, that may have applications, I think, and I would like to make the case for, to these other communication, to these other forms of bodily communication. So I'm going to start off by sort of laying the definitional groundwork for these different silos before bringing them together. So a gesture is, to put it simply, a discrete movement of body parts that achieve a goal through communication rather than mechanical effectiveness. Now, what this means is that an individual moves their body, um, so if I was to reach out and pick up this pen on my desk, that has been a mechanically effective action. I have achieved my own goal of getting the pen by picking it up myself. If someone else were in the room with me and I pointed to the pen, and probably gaze alternated with them and waited for them to give me the pen, then I've used a pointing gesture to communicate rather than to achieve the goal of getting the pencil by mechanically effective means. That's kind of the Spark Notes version. So as I said, Kat Hobater gave this wonderful lecture last year where she goes really in depth into what we know and what we've been researching on great ape gesture. I've put the QR code up on the screen too. So this is on YouTube. You can find it through all of the interspecies accounts as well. Where she goes into much more detail about how we define gesture, what gestures are used for. So this is, I'm summarizing here so that I don't repeat a previous lecture entirely. So I'm going to show some video examples of what these gestures look like. And I want you to notice here, I'm going to show you 3 gestures from 3 different communities of great apes. Now, the first is from the Kamekake group of bonobos at Wamba in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this juvenile in the middle leans back and raises his arm above his head. And then his mother actually does another gesture, like a grab pull gesture, to lead him off for grooming. I'm going to play it one more time. So he leans back. You can see this arm raised gesture exposing the whole side of his body. And then he gets led off and they start grooming. Now, this is one of the videos from Kat Hobater's talk, so you might recognize that as well. This is an adult male chimpanzee from Bodongo in Uganda, who is also going to do an arm raise gesture. So here he's raising his arm above his head. You might notice here as well, he does a big loud scratch first, raises an arm above his head, shakes a branch, and then there's a female in the top of the screen and she comes down and they start grooming together. So here we have a bonobo using an arm raise gesture to initiate grooming. We have an Eastern chimpanzee using an arm raise gesture to initiate grooming. And here we have a Western chimpanzee from Fongoli in Senegal, also an adult male, also raising his arm above his head, waiting. This female approaches and then they start grooming. I'm going to play this one more time so you can see he's raising his arm above his head. So you can see through all of these videos what I mean by these being discrete movements, right? It's a very specific body movement. They're morphologically similar. You see the same gesture form being used across individuals, across communities, across species. And they're not mechanically achieving their goal. They're not like starting to groom, right? It's not an action that is like pulling another individual in to groom. They are gesturing, waiting for a response. And then once the individual is ready, they eventually start grooming. Now, we code the gesture footage in ELAN now. My previous coding, I used FileMaker, but excitingly, we've converted our gestural coding scheme into ELAN, and this is now an open source, like we published it, open access, so that you can take this coding scheme, you can adapt it to your species, you can adapt it to your research needs. Within this coding scheme, we code things um, like the identity of the signaler, what gestures being used, what body parts being used, how long the duration of that like initial movement of the gesture is, how long that movement is held for. So really getting into great detail about these, about the gestures that the great apes are using. Currently, we're still working on this huge cross-species comparison. Currently, we know that the chimpanzee and bonobo repertoire overlaps by roughly 90% if we compare the bonobos at Wamba to the eastern chimpanzees at Bodongo. But we expect this overlap to be somewhat larger once we include more communities of eastern chimpanzees, more communities of bonobos, and also including central and western chimpanzees. So you saw in the videos that we're really coding these shared gesture types across species, which is really interesting in terms of thinking about how gestural communication has evolved. It seems like these gestures are largely shared, but they're also flexibly and intentionally used. We get then towards the meanings of gestures. It's interesting to us that these gestures share the same physical shape, but they could have completely different meanings, right? And so to get at what gestures mean, um, I take the approach, like Kat, of looking at the apparently satisfactory outcome. So this is the outcome of the signaler, the outcome, the reaction of the recipient that satisfies the signaler. So in this example, we have a little animated, like big loud scratch gesture. The recipient comes and starts to groom the individual. In this instance, we would say that the gesture type was a big loud scratch. And the meaning or the apparently satisfactory outcome was to initiate grooming. And this matrix shows the comparison of bonobo and chimpanzee gestures and their meanings. For the gesture types that from my PhD, we had enough data to analyze. Again, we're hoping to expand these analyses very shortly. But this gives you a rough view of how much the gestures have shared meanings. So where you see a black cell, that is where both chimpanzees and bonobos use this gesture for this outcome. White is where neither bonobos nor chimpanzees use this gesture for this outcome. So both and neither show overlap, right? Either both of them are using it or neither of them are using it. Blue is where only bonobos were seen using this gesture for this outcome, and green is where only chimpanzees are using this gesture for this outcome. One of the things that I think is quite interesting to note here is that we find that for gestures that have fewer outcomes, you might say stricter meanings, there seems to be higher overlap between the species than the gestures that have multiple or more ambiguous meanings. If we take the similarity of the bonobo and chimpanzee gestures and meanings, that's represented by this vertical red line on the graph here. Compared to 10,000 randomized iterations of the same matrix with different constraints on row or column numbers, so the numbers of ones and zeros in the rows and columns, where no constraints has the same number of ones and zeros overall in the table, but isn't constrained by row or column. And then the top is the strictest way of doing it, where we've constrained that all of the rows and all of the columns must have the correct number or the same number of ones and zeros. The chimpanzee and bonobo repertoire is significantly more similar than we would expect by random chance in this kind of matrix. So this is demonstrating that in their gestural repertoire, not only do they have a massive overlap of the gesture forms, but they also have a huge overlap in what these gestures mean. Shifting now to thinking about displays. Displays are, I'm going to show you some video examples. They are these stereotyped or ritualized movements. Again, it's movements of body parts, it's how the bodies are moving. But rather than being used intentionally in this goal-directed way to achieve a particular behavioral outcome, displays are thought to communicate about the quality of the signaler. So I'm going to show you a display here. Lex at Fongoli is going to come across the screen. He's going to slap the ground a few times. So we don't see other individuals in this video. They're down in that denser foliage there. And this display is not directed towards a specific individual in the way that we saw the gestures were, but seems to be broadcast to a multitude of individuals, right? Anyone in that area behind Lex can hear this slapping sound when he throws the rocks. These displays are more broadcast. They tend to include these repeated features like slapping the ground, like throwing stones. Here we have Jumpkin. You can see there's a little bit of leaf on his lip from where he's been leaf clipping. There's often this build-up phase. They often are accompanied by vocal signals as well, like pant toots. And Jumpkin throws the rock to the ground and then runs off shaking a branch as well. I'll play it one more time. So he picks up this rock, runs bipedally as well, throws down the rock and shakes a branch. So these are all bodily movements. They're all a kind of communication, but we don't currently treat them when I'm coding gestures at the moment or in the past. I've just ignored display. Here's another example. This is Dawson, and it's very windy, so the audio is a bit blustery. But he's rolling this large stone. He's been swaying, he rolls a large stone. It makes a large splash in the water. He picks up a vine, potentially to attempt to drag it in another display. And here we have quite a well-known type of chimpanzee display that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, drumming on buttress roots. So this is Lex again. He's pant tooting. He's drumming on the root of this tree. So these are all videos that show these quite like loud acoustic displays, but that are produced by bodily movements. And when I say that I used to only code or to ignore display when I would code gestures, I now find that I've started applying our gestural coding scheme to the displays. and find that I have not had to add an element to the coding scheme in order to incorporate, in order to code displays. So a lot of these elements, things like hitting an object, can also be used as a gesture. We code that regularly, or hitting the ground. Bipedal locomotion, this like swagger where they stand up and walk or run, can also be used gesturally. Like we also code that within gestural communication. Throwing objects can also be used gesturally. There are so many of these elements that are used in displays that are also used gesturally. And so leveraging this like new or this like more developed coding scheme for also including displays and other bodily communication, I think is just so powerful. And we might start to see, I think we might start to think about this relationship between display and gesture as similar to something like songs and calls, where we're seeing like shared elements, but produced towards different types of outcomes or different types of communication. And I think that's really, really potentially exciting. So posture has been the least thoroughly examined in research in the past on great ape bodily communication. Um, it's difficult to code and to classify because whatever position a body is in can be posture, right? Like it's about this holistic position in which a body is held, like a position or a movement of the entire body. And it may just be how the body is moving through space or being held, but it may also be used to communicate a specific goal or internal state. So there's kind of a methodological messiness here that's quite uncomfortable, but I think we're approaching being able to look at posture more systematically. And in fact, I already code some postures as gestures because we have seen them consistently enough used with these, like alongside these criteria for intentional communication, to say that, hey, a bipedal stance, like standing up in this bipedal position with arms out to the side, I've seen that enough times where they are it's socially used, it's directed towards another individual, they wait for a response, that it's used in like for goal directed communication. Same for like bounce, same for headstands, same for these like postures where chimpanzees or bonobos will present their genitals to one another. Rocking, very commonly coded or reported gesture, has been widely reported across great apes. In terms of being a gesture, if we look back to some of the earliest publications from Wamba by Kano, we see like this rocking gesture is reported there, but also as a posture, right? Like it's the whole body moving. And stiff walk as well. So there are particular postures where we are including them already as gestures. Um, but these are ones where it's very much up to the discretion of the observer. And what would be really helpful, I think, would be to be able to have some way of identifying subtle differences in posture and understanding better, having a more systematic way of identifying this is a posture that is being used for a communicative purpose. So in this video, we have two female bonobos, and they're going to use a combination of gestures and postures that I would code as gestures currently. So Kiku first walks forward, She swings her arms, she rocks her hips, and then she stands up fully with her arms out. So there, this female on, we're looking at the female with her back to us again. They both gesture, but I want to not make it too complicated. So Kiku is first like leaning forward, swings her arms, rocks her hips, and then stands up bipedally with her arms out. And this is to solicit genitogenital rubbing. So I'm already incorporating posture into this gestural coding. And I alluded to being like on the verge of having better tools for doing this. And things like deep lab cut, pose estimation software, I think will be very, hopefully, obviously taking everyone, I'm sure many of you here are familiar with the challenges of moving from pose estimation to behavior detection. But I think we're really getting a grasp on this first step of pose estimation to the point where it will soon likely be helpful in the study of gesture, but also posture. And so this publication came again out of Kat Hobater's group when I was working there with one of our PhD students. And this is a tool that you can use again to get pose estimation for great apes in the wild, which is incredible, I think. It's not only primates in a clear sort of open setting. This is like with branches in front. This is with shaky cameras. It's incredible to be able to have these tools developing. I think for posture in particular, there may also be, I know that some other groups have been developing more mask-based programs for pose estimation. So not just taking these skeletal points, but taking sort of a full like mask overlay, which could have potential, although I'm much less familiar with those. But I'm hopeful that soon tools like this should allow us to, to be able to actually catalog posture in a more satisfactory way than just like throwing it in when the researchers are able to identify it as communicative in the first place and are able to code it reliably. So that's my case for this combination of gesture, posture, and display. I think this video coding scheme can be applied broadly across bodily communication. And I think that newly developing AI programs and deep learning programs can help us to develop tools that will, I mean, hopefully one day automate video coding would be a dream, but that can also standardize our approach for looking at more subtle differences in gesture and posture. Why is it important? Why do I care about studying bodily communication as a whole, right? I think we have a really developed field on gestural communication. There is a lot of research on display as well. I think there's emerging research on posture, but why is it important to bring these together and to be able to study bodily communication more holistically? And I think that there are three main reasons for this, all of them to do with broadening the comparisons that we can make. I think the first is intentional communication. The second is multimodal communication. And then the third, I've cheekily dubbed an interspecies internet. So I think it's important when we talk, this comparison is important to intentional communication. And I'm going to first, I said I would leave the gesture definitions to Kat's previous lecture, but I do need to give a little introduction to Grice and to intentionality in order to explain why intentional communication and the study of intentional communication is enhanced by a more holistic view of bodily communication. So intentional communication is when an individual holds a goal in mind and communicates in a goal-directed way, so in order to achieve that goal. And that goal might be to change the behavior of another individual. We would call that first order intentional communication, or it might be to change the mind of another individual, change their knowledge state. And that would be second order or higher. It increases in the like meaning to let you know that I know that you know that I know ad infinitum. But for our purposes here, that first stage of intentional communication where an individual aims to change the behavior of another individual is the most important. And researchers have established a framework of criteria for identifying when communication can be said to be goal-directed and to be intentional. So that it's used socially. This means that they would signal in the presence of an audience, but not in the absence of an audience. That the composition and behavior of the audience may affect the signal being used. So social use, sensitivity to attentional state of recipient. You need to be using a signal that is appropriate to the perception of your interlocutor. So if they're looking at you, you can use a visual signal, but if they're not, an audible or a tactile or another type of signal might be more appropriate. Manipulating the attentional state. So maybe instead of using a different type of gesture, you move into view of the recipient. And then this audience checking and gaze alternation, indicating that that a signaler is aware of the audience and making sure that their signals are appropriate. So these criteria tell us, we think these criteria tell us when a signal is intentional. And when we're studying gestures, we end up excluding a whole load of signals that do not meet these criteria. So for instance, I was looking, and often we don't report, so I was doing a bit of a literature search and was seeing how many people report the gestures that they exclude because they don't meet the intentionality criteria. And this is something that Yitzhak Ben Mocha has also pointed out. We're very good at reporting how many gestures do meet the intentionality criteria. So in this paper by Hobater and Byrne, 2011, there are 4,397 gestures that do meet the criteria. But then many other potential gestures were excluded because they failed to meet one or more of the requirements for intentional use. And we don't discard facial or vocal communication for not meeting intentionality criteria. So when we're comparing gestural communication to vocal communication or facial communication, we've already pre-selected that we're only taking gestures that meet the criteria for intentionality. Now, I think this was important historically because gestures are body movements and we're trying to identify which body movements are communicative. But it does mean that we're not always comparing like with like when we're comparing across communication types. And in only studying intentional gestures, we don't really know, and we're not putting numbers on it in our publications, how much of the bodily communication fails to meet these criteria. So I wouldn't code display because it doesn't meet this like social use, audience checking, sensitivity to attentional state criteria. I just wouldn't code display, and so I wouldn't do direct comparisons between gesture and display and posture. So this is why I think I just don't think that we can understand intentional communication if we are only selecting for intentional signals based on these criteria. I think we need to broaden it and make it a comparison and include bodily communication that also does not meet these criteria. And in some ways, that should help us to validate these criteria and to see whether they're actually getting at this like cognitive underpinning that we think that they are. Because if we're only analyzing the gestures that meet the criteria, then we know nothing about any of the other bodily communication. Relatedly, multimodal communication, I think I touched on this when we were talking about intentionality, that we end up with vocal and facial signals being treated really different to gestures. And I wanted to take greetings as an example for multimodal communication, because we see in greetings there's this combination of gestural, vocal, and facial combinations. This is your classic like great ape multimodal trifecta. They've got their gestures, they've got their vocalizations, they have their facial signals. But there's also other bodily communication that's happening alongside it that might not be considered part of gesture currently. There's elements of gesture, there can be elements of display, there can be elements of posture as well. These greetings happen when chimpanzees are traveling together or meeting back up. And they're interesting too because there's no obvious behavioral outcome. As you'll see in the videos, it's usually the individuals are traveling. So if I were to code this in a gestural coding scheme, they're traveling, they signal, and they continue traveling. There's not necessarily a change, an observable change in behavior. Yes, Cynthia.
Uh, Sorry, that was a mistake.
Nope, that's okay.
I do have a question, but that's for later.
All right, I'll wait for later then. So in this video, we have Sai on the left, and he's going to approach Lily on the right. So he's walking up over some distance. The groups are meeting up, or the parties are meeting up together. So Sai puts his fingers into Lily's mouth. Lily puts her fingers into Sai's mouth. They stand up. You can see they're panting at the same time. And Lily touches Sai's genitals. So we have these like approaches, we have gestures, we have vocal or maybe subvocal, right? We have breath communication as well, like breathing. Greetings are like these they're just deep, they're profoundly multimodal, and I think that expansion of including more broad bodily communication, looking at these postures as well, will be really helpful. This is an example with Mike, and I can't remember who's behind him. They've been traveling, they've just started grooming, and then they turn around and they stand up bipedally, swagger on all fours. Yeah, swagger on all fours. I'm going to play that again. So they're both bipedal. Mike puts his hand in Lex's mouth. You probably notice also that in a lot of the videos of displays earlier, and then also in some of these greeting videos, that the chimpanzees are piloerect, so their hair is standing up. And we would use this usually as a crude measure of arousal. And with a previous collaborator, Katie Slocum, we've been talking about how much we can rule out arousal as a mechanism that causes individuals to communicate, right? As a trigger. And so if we were to discount these kinds of signals based on piloerection as a measure of arousal, then none of this would be considered intentional communication, and you wouldn't code any of this either. So having, I think, not throwing out the intentionality criteria, but having them as a tool for comparison, and asking how many of the criteria are met or not, including bodily communication more broadly, as well as facial and vocal signals. And then for other species, right, signals in other modalities that are also relevant to them. Which brings me to the final point of comparability, this interspecies internet, where I think these points on intentionality and multimodality are important to think about comparing with other species, because I think there's been really great work by like Redwan Bashari and others looking for intentional communication in fish and in other distantly related species, but that's the exception rather than the norm. And so in order to compare communication across species, expanding to look at bodily communication more holistically, not only intentionally produced bodily communication, and then also including these other multimodal forms of communication will be important. But I think the big point that I wanted to make here on why look at bodily communication rather than gesture is this really obvious that different species have different body plans. And if our definition of gesture doesn't allow for those different body plans, then it becomes really, really difficult to compare across other species. And so I think we have become more open to different views of gesture, again, including posture sometimes when we think it makes sense. But really, I think just broaden out the framework for bodily communication allows us to ask so much more about how other species are moving their bodies in order to communicate, so that we can really start to understand the phylogeny of bodily communication more broadly, because it seems to be such an important feature for primates, and we really don't and it's just really siloed right now. And so the discussion of primate gestural communication, I think, could benefit a lot from broadening out and having more of these discussions with other folks about what gesture might look like with your species, what posture might look like, what display might look like, how bodily communication works across different species. So that's it for me. This was very much a discussion starting talk rather than an answer giving talk. I hope that that was okay, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Before we move on, I wanted to give a little plug for the Animal Behavior Collective. I think particularly at the moment, it's really difficult for students to find funding and financial support, and the Animal Behavior Collective provides microgrants to students for things like rent and groceries and childcare and like whatever financial needs students have, they can apply for these microgrants to help try to offset them a bit. And we also do mentorship matching too. So if you can contribute financially, or if you could become a mentor, please sign up. And if you're a student and you are looking for more financial aid or looking for mentorship, you can also apply. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for that fascinating look at your work and this ambitious holistic research program and future directions for the field. Yeah, as usual, we're going to open things up for questions and comments. So just before we begin, I want to remind everyone how to contribute to the discussion. Either use the chat function by selecting the chat icon and posting your questions in the chat log. And if you'd like to ask your question on the call, select the React icon and then the raise hand function. And feel free to introduce yourself and say something about your background before speaking if you'd like to as well. Yeah, Ralph, you want to kick things off?
Sure. I'm Ralph Akampora in philosophy at Hofstra. And it was a great talk. Thanks a lot. I'm wondering, pushing the envelope here, whether plants do or have posture or display.
I think that's a great question. I was teaching evolution and behavior last semester, and my students were asking if plants can be said to behave.
Yeah.
I suppose you might be able to like physiologically consider plants as having posture, but not in a communicative way as far as we understand it. Because to my knowledge, they don't have the ability to recognize other plants' postures.
Fair enough.
Mm-hmm. But you might, I don't know if you might consider some chemical signaling. I mean, it's not display in the sense of these like stereotype ritualized displays that we have, but in terms of communication, like I think you could say that plants communicate through chemical signaling.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Cynthia?
Yeah, now, let's see, did I get that? Just a second. Aha. Sorry, I teach philosophy and humor, and I was wondering if I was going to ask if a more holistic approach also allows for an understanding of more sophisticated kind of communication than without it. And I was thinking in part something that Catherine Hobader said last time when she was visiting here with this group. And she began talking a little bit about sarcasm, different forms of irony that she noticed. And one story of a chimpanzee who was lesser ranked, who had to had to apologize to a higher ranking guy, as she said. And there was a kind of double coding where there was both I don't know if you'd call it like the gesture of or display, but maybe a gesture of apology, but then a look of sarcasm, as she said, like a teenager, something like that, like, and kind of taking it back at the same time. And so if it might be like compounding a gesture on top of a display, or display on top of a gesture, or something like that would allow you to get at, irony, meaning something different from what you seem to mean, or more sophisticated kind of gestures or communication, I guess I should say.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely potential for that, and I think also for things like understanding social roles, like demonstrating that they have an understanding of social roles. Like we know through different interactions, like we can look across the hierarchy for primates, like in a really well-established way, but how much they recognize their role. I think things like the speed with which they approach another individual, the posture, I think there would be really interesting, whether it's a sort of, and I think this is this is part of the frustration, is that you can see like there is a difference between a chimpanzee confidently walking towards another chimpanzee and a chimpanzee slowly like skirting around and still being noticed, like, and knowing that they're within the visual field. And so they will crouch is sometimes coded as a gesture and is often used in these kind of more submissive but walking past another individual. And so sometimes they'll walk along trails because it's easier. It might be human-made trails, it might be like trails from bush pigs and deer and things. But sometimes you want to go around another chimpanzee. And I think there you see these differences in posture and approach that I think probably communicates that like I'm coming past you, but like sorry, I don't mean to inconvenience you, and gets at those kinds of like social negotiations and social norms a bit.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah. And do you code those for ever for, shaming or, I don't know, a sense of pride or a sense of humility, or is that like kind of going beyond what
Yeah,
you?
not currently. And I think part of it is just like the difficulty in coding that as an observer versus having, yeah, because it's just like it's such subtle things that you're like, I'm pretty sure this is what I'm seeing, but I don't think that I could like satisfactorily code and publish and like demonstrate this.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yes, Monica.
Hi there, Kirsty. First of all, I just want to say thank you. This was fascinating, and I really enjoyed that talk. Um, my name is Monica Flores. I'm in communications and city government. However, I'm studying animal law to try to one day be an animal law lawyer. So learning a lot. But my question is, on Interspecies Internet, how do you see the concept of interspecies internet evolving with advancements in behavior tracking AI? But also, do you think it could help establish a shared framework of some sort, maybe comparing communication across species, maybe vastly different body plans?
Yeah, no, I think I feel like there's an answer within the question. It's almost like, yes, I agree with you. There, like we are like we're definitely approaching this moment that's really exciting, and particularly for people like me and many on the call, I'm sure, who have spent years coding videos. Like when we so Elan is an incredibly useful program. There's other video coding programs like it, like The Observer or Solomon or Boris, and they're all really great and they allow us to get a lot of detail out of our behavioral observations. And it takes a really long time. Like I might spend 6 months in the field and then 6 months coding that video from the field. Um, it takes a long, long time to get through video coding. And then for the amount of data, so in the group with Kat Hobater, we have like decades of experience between us, collaborations across multiple field sites with vast video archives, um, and we're really just starting to get at a lot of these questions on meanings in communication, because for things like, so I mentioned briefly that some of the gestures have multiple meanings, and what we think is happening is that context is really important. And so like the behavioral context that's happening when they gesture affects the meaning, like that is also information to them. But by the time you get to this gesture type with this meaning, with this context, the sample size, like the data is so small, there are so few data points. And so being able to automate video coding would completely change our ability to understand how great apes are communicating. I'm thinking about like all of the field sites that have long-term video databases, that would take as much time as they took to collect to code currently based on our current coding. And if there was a way to automate that coding and to be able to identify gestures and outcomes from that, we could look at individual differences in a really meaningful way. We could look at community variation. Like there are so many more questions that we could ask. We ask about these subtle differences. Like, does it matter? Is there a difference if I'm raising my arm with like a bent elbow and a bent wrist, or with like a straight arm? So that automation, I think, will allow us to answer far more specific questions, um, within great apes, but also across species. Like I'm thinking of so many other other species where there's long-term video databases, right? And if we could, yeah, if we could automate that coding.
Possibilities are endless, I'm sure.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We've got a question in the chat from Casey Cox. Casey asks, as tech-like ELAN advances, is the goal to replace live coding and ethogram style observation? Or is there something essential about human interpretation that you think we would lose?
Thanks, Casey. I think that's a really, really good question. I think we are likely to always need people observing other species. We may be able to do it more or less remotely. But I think it's the experience working with other species that opens up a lot of the questions in the first place. And then when it comes time to like when we're building these coding schemes, they're built with like we are creating a catalog of gestures that we see. So even if that becomes automated, it's being determined by human observers in the first place. And I think the research questions obviously have to be developed by human observers. But I'm sure that many of you have experienced working on a research project, and by observing those animals or those participants, you realize that there's something that they're doing that you hadn't thought about before. So it's kind of, I mean, I guess it's thinking about how we use technology in general, right? Where the input, like that human input at the very start is absolutely crucial. And I think that there's points like automating the video coding will be really, really helpful, but it will still require people to observe the chimpanzees and to ask the questions and to develop the coding scheme that will then be automated, and probably also like need to be verified by people as well, right? In the way that we do intra-observer reliability now, where when I code my videos, someone will code 10 or 20% of them and be compared to see that we're coding in the same way. I imagine that we will still do that intra-observer reliability with automated video coding.
I have a question maybe I could pose while others are considering theirs. So yeah, you talked about this sort of methodological puzzle of how to study primate communication that doesn't solicit visible responses, or you call them apparently satisfactory outcomes, or just in general, maybe they don't meet other intentionality criteria, and that overcoming this problem is really important for advances in the field. And then, sort of focused on greetings as a kind of multimodal communication, where it's imperative to treat all these different forms of communication holistically, like vocal, facial, gestural, maybe subvocal. You mentioned breath, which seems like very interesting. And I was wondering if you could give us just some more examples of communication besides greeting that might warrant similar consideration that, could sort of benefit from broadening this framework of understanding early communication and its relationship to other forms.
Yeah. So I said earlier that we throw out a whole load of gestures that don't meet the criteria for intentionality. When it comes to looking at meaning, we also throw out a whole load of gestures that aren't successful, that don't have a change in behavior that's observable. So for my paper on bonobo gestures, I'm going to need to estimate the numbers. There were about 4,500 gesture instances that I observed, and like 2,800 of those were successful. So I'm discarding like maybe a third from the meaning analysis because they're unsuccessful, which means, but we don't know why they're unsuccessful. So there's different options within that. It might be that the recipient didn't want to do the thing that the signaler was asking. They weren't motivated to do it. It might be that they didn't understand it, like that they didn't know what was being requested of them and they didn't do anything. Or it might be that what was requested didn't require a change in behavior. So there are whole loads of meanings in human communication where I'm not asking you to do something, I'm just telling you stuff. So for those kinds of informative meanings, you wouldn't expect to observe a change in behavior. And so we don't know if other primates are using signals for these types of informative meanings. If they were saying, oh, it's good fruit, you wouldn't expect a change in behavior there. And so I think not specific contexts like greeting. I think greeting and affiliation in general are interesting because the change in behavior is difficult to assess there. But I think we have this whole load of gestures that we're currently calling unsuccessful, that we could really dig into and try to get at why they are unsuccessful and whether it's a motivation, whether it's an understanding, or whether it's just not that type of meaning.
Yeah, and that last form that you mentioned, maybe there's seems to me maybe like informative meanings are too far away from the kind of mechanical effectiveness that is being replaced with certain communication types that meet the intentionality criteria, where there's this like immediate desired behavioral response.
Yeah.
Treasure, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you for the talk, Kirsty. My question is regarding plasticity. Assuming their natural environment evolves, do the animals have new gestures to address new or novel situations, like unexpected weather related to climate change or human encroachment, like the addition of new machines or activities that they now have to define that didn't exist before?
Yeah, potentially. We know that great apes in captivity do acquire new gestures. So in captivity, they're much more likely to point than they would in the wild. And that's this like exposure to, we think that's because of exposure to people. There's I reviewed a paper. I can't remember if it's out yet. I reviewed a paper and a primate used a gesture that they had observed a keeper using, and they were using it in a similar way. And I think that there is this potential to learn new gestures in new ways, and I think that's a real possibility. I think particularly we see, yeah, as you say, like proximity between non-human great apes and people, and also looking towards these populations in Senegal and in Guinea that are really at the edge of what is survivable in terms of climate for them. It's so dry. There's such big seasonal difference in food availability. Yeah, but that kind of cultural difference or like community differences, we're starting to be able to study more, but I think there's definitely, we know that great apes can learn new gestures, and I think it wouldn't be surprising that chimpanzees in novel environments would develop new gestures. And in fact, I recently published a paper that's more theoretical, so for the philosophers, with Richard Moore and Federico Rossano, which posits that a lot of the bodily communication, they're using bodily movements that in some way resemble the action that they're requesting, or the part of the body that they want another individual to interact with, or the like direction they want another individual to move. And in that paper, we predict that given new behavior types, new gestures or new bodily communication should emerge around that.
And a quick corollary, are you seeing more stressful reactions as they become more stressed, basically?
Yeah, there's someone working at Fungoli while I was there looking at urinary cortisol levels. And we see differences in like seasonal stress related to heat and dehydration and things like that. Yeah, so we do see differences in stress levels. And I'm not sure of any research that has looked at that in relation to communication in terms of how stress impacts on communication in non-human great apes. Thank you.
Thank you, Treasure. Courtney asks in the chat, in the matrix that you showed of bonobo and chimp gesture overlaps, a lot of meaning had more than one gesture associated with it. For meanings that are associated with lots of gestures, can those meanings be further distinguished by which gesture is used to signal them? Would adding posture or display help to distinguish them?
Yeah, so there seems to be this real redundancy in the gestural communication of primates, in that they're using around 80 gesture types, depending on how you split and lump, to achieve around 20 behavioral outcomes. And so there is a lot of redundancy where there's several gestures that can achieve the same thing. And then there's also redundancy the other way. So a single gesture can have multiple meanings, and a single meaning can be associated with multiple gestures. I have looked at whether combinations of gestures seems to affect the meaning of like the outcome. So does a gesture on its own mean the same as a gesture used in a sequence? Does the position in the sequence seem to matter? And for bonobos, there wasn't evidence there, so it didn't seem to be syntactic. But the behavior that the bonobo was doing when they gestured did seem to disambiguate it. And also who is communicating with who sometimes disambiguates it. And this starts to get at one of the other issues of meaning when we're studying other species, which is that we are trying to express non-linguistic concepts linguistically. So the identity of an individual can change the meaning, in that if an adult reaches towards an infant, it can mean climb on my back. And if an infant reaches towards an adult, it can mean pick me up. So we have linguistically assigned it two different meanings, but it may conceptually be the same thing for them. So some of those multiple meanings may be an artifact of human researchers deciding what the meanings are. And I think this is a huge question for the interspecies internet, right? Is like, how are we expressing and understanding meaning for these non-linguistic mental representations? Because the other example, and I have a paper with Michelle Rodriguez that is coming out soon, where we're looking at same-sex behavior in bonobos. And the gestures that are used to solicit genito-genital rubbing, so female-female sexual behavior, are the same as for copulation, so for female and male sexual behavior. So they're using the same gestures, and as researchers were saying, these are two different meanings because they, for us, are two different types of sexual behavior. But if the bonobos are using the same gestures to solicit this like behavior, they're producing the same vocalizations during the behavior. Perhaps through that communication, we might understand it that this is actually a shared concept that we are arbitrarily separating because of our definition of that meaning. I feel like I maybe went a different way with that question, Courtney, so let me know if you have any follow-ups.
Yeah, always tricky to. Oh, Courtney, are you?
Yes, I can't turn my camera on. I just want to say that was fantastic, and you went in a great direction. So
Okay,
thank
great.
I was curious. Like I've heard you discuss in other podcasts and interviews this idea of the complexity of gestural communication in terms of expressing intentionality for both proximate and long-term goals. You, you didn't really get into it so much in this talk, but I'm very interested in that, and I'm sort of just to see if I understand what you were sort of saying. I'm assuming the difference is something like a communicative gesture that signals the intent to shape a recipient's behavior in the present, and another that signals an intent to shape a receiver's behavior sometime further into the future. And in these other contexts, these other podcasts and interviews, that you mentioned that the latter can be seen sometimes in the context of consortship. And I'm curious, yeah, I don't know, just this type of goal-oriented behavior that projects one's intentions or anticipates the actions of other agents outside of one's immediate contacts. So if I'm understanding it correctly, it's sort of like this ability to seek to satisfy ends in outside of the present, or instead of, and is instead capable of modeling the world and forecasting preferential outcomes in this more abstract space of possibilities. And maybe this has something to do with Grice and second order intentionality, or this ability to change I think you called it the knowledge state of other agents. So yeah, I'm just hoping to understand a little bit more about that, if you could.
Yeah, I guess it gets at Grace. Also, I'm like, as soon as you're talking about proximate and ultimate, I'm on to Tinbergen's 4 questions, and yeah. But I think so. There's this question of time scale from a methodological perspective that I think is tricky because of how we collect and code video data, where you are getting at this question of how a gesture might impact on future behavior. And we also want to think about how previous contexts, not just the immediate previous context, but other things that have happened during the day, or maybe during the week, or maybe over their like extreme experiences over their lifetime, have affected like this communication. What is their relationship to this individual who they're communicating with? And when we're filming a short interaction, and maybe filming for like a couple of minutes, maybe filming for 10, 15, 20 minutes, we can get at like this very short time range of what's happening. But then there, like, as you say, it may be leading towards something in the future. So as an example, this courtship example, it might be that a male is using gestures throughout the day that are like, follow me, like travel with me. And the immediate outcome of the gesture is that the female is following him and traveling with him. But there's this future goal that they are traveling away from the group in order to have sex. And so we're coding it for this immediate goal, but in the background there may also be, as you say, like this longer term goal. And I don't know that I've thought about that in terms of Grice. I think there's, but what I think there's more and more attention being paid to common ground in non-human communication, and I think that that's maybe an interesting way to take it. So to what extent do the individuals share this like common ground and like understand their shared common ground? Like I'm thinking of like some of Josh Armstrong's work. Um, and I think Marlene Fröhlich is currently doing some research on common ground in primate communication, or is moving towards that, which might help to get at the underlying meanings a bit more too. But yeah, I mean, it's difficult. It's really difficult to get at multiple layered meanings methodologically. Yeah, Treasure.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I was curious to know if females give birth alone, solitarily, or is there like a small group where like a midwife or something where they would need support in just a general kind of way, since childbirth is such a stressful problem, or such a big deal.
Yeah, we know very little about childbirth in wild non-human primates. Often the researchers will observe the female go up into the nest at night and she's pregnant and comes down the next morning with an infant. So I think there's maybe been one or two observed cases that I can think of. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
I have one more question, if I could. Um, uh, yeah, so, I mean, in this talk, you discussed these efforts to, or introduce sort of these efforts to map a phylogenetic history of gestural communication. And I've also heard you discuss in other places how researchers are sort of now accepting that the acquisition of gestural communication is neither exclusively innate, nor is it, I think the term that you use is ontogenetically ritualized, maybe a kind of like process of learning, but a mixture of these two things. And I was wondering how this perspective shapes how one might trace the evolutionary history of gestural communication, in the sense that, sort of the notion of evolutionary development and diversification in that context would involve non-genetic processes or non-biologically inherited traits, which to my understanding is the more common view for phylogenetics. And maybe there are like sort of existing phylogenetic approaches to things like questions of the evolutionary or historical development of human language and culture that might be relevant to your work in that area, or just curious how that works. Yeah.
Yeah. So what Richard Moore and Federico Rossano and I are positing is that rather than each single gesture type in this like 80 plus gesture repertoire, each being genetically encoded, or each of those gestures being learned through this process of ontogenetic ritualization, which is like repeated actions that over experience become gestures, is that rather the non-human great apes do inherit a capacity for gesture, like a capacity to understand other individuals as potential interlocutors, as communicative agents, and that by virtue of having similar bodies and similar social goals, that there is a large overlap in the repertoire because they are using gestures that to some extent like make sense for that outcome. It directs an individual to go somewhere specific. It shows them a certain place on the body to interact with. It resembles part of an action or facilitates part of an action. And that might not be the case for all gesture types. We know, like what Treasure asked earlier, that that they can learn additional gesture types, and we think that like there's probably evidence of like learning and incorporating new gestures. But that, yeah, they seem that it's more this ability to attend to others, in like have this social attention, to share this common ground, and to like recognize each other as communicative agents.
Right. So maybe the sort of cognitive underpinnings for those capacities in a general sense might be genetically inherited, and then also the morphology of the species is biologically inherited, and that you were discussing earlier might be related also to learning through the proximity of certain kinds of body types to the like intentional outcomes of gestures and things like that.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat, maybe the last one we'll take, from Chloe. Chloe says, "Hi, Kirsty, great talk. Do you have any suggestions for reducing human bias in assigning meaning to animal gestures? Do you believe that researchers from different backgrounds may make significantly different assumptions about the same communication?"
Yeah, I think that is a yes. Like to the second question, yes, I think that like as researchers, we bring our own experiences to things. Like on the example of separating out meanings for genitogenital rubbing and for copulation, like as a queer researcher, I'm like, maybe they're both just sexual behavior, and that we've been treating them differently. So I think for meanings, yeah, I think there's probably different interpretations of meanings that different researchers would consider. And I think I've been thinking of like how to conceptualize almost a filter approach for meanings, where some gestures may have more or less specific meanings. It might be generally an encouragement to engage with one another or a discouragement. And then like filter down to a next level, it might be a request for an object, or it might be a request for an activity, or it might be like a denial of an object or a denial of an activity. And that by developing a system for filtering through different meanings, we could possibly like realize which level to stop at. Because maybe the gestures that have ambiguous meanings, we just have gone too fine-grained, and that actually that arm raise gesture that has like 6 different meanings doesn't mean those 6 specific things, but means like, please interact with me. And then there's other information that gets you to those specific outcomes. So yes, I think that having researchers from different backgrounds with different experiences will be absolutely crucial. And I think maybe filtering through the different options can allow us to get to like a more appropriate level for each of the gesture meanings.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's about all the time I think that we have today, but thank you to everyone for such a wonderful discussion, and to Kirsty for this stimulating talk. If you'd like to follow Kirsty's research, I've posted some links in the chat right here. It's the personal website and some social accounts. So yeah, thank you once again to the Interspecies Internet community for your engagement and interest in our monthly Interspecies Conversations lecture series. If you'd like to learn more about our organization, stay up to date with our lecture schedule and other events, projects, and activities, or connect with a community of researchers and enthusiasts, then please follow us on social media, visit our YouTube channel, join our Slack, and subscribe to our newsletter. Carolina, I think, just posted the links there in the chat for you. So yeah, once more on behalf of Interspecies Internet, the trustees and our community, thank you very much, Kirsty, for joining us today to present and discuss your fascinating research. And thanks to everyone in attendance for your engagement, curiosity, and expertise. Yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone next month for another Interspecies Conversations event, and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.